Lightning split the sky, but the rain had yet to fall. I woke up to find myself no longer in the familiar dorm room. The air around me seemed to carry an unfamiliar dampness, and the overhead light was glaring, casting everything around me as strange and unfamiliar. Just moments ago I had been asleep, but now I was lying in a pitch-black room, empty and devoid of warmth. A strange feeling of fear began to rise within me. I raised my hand to touch my face and felt an odd discomfort. Something wasn't right. How could this be? My face no longer resembled the one I remembered. Just as I was still confused, a voice from a boy beside me broke through, filled with urgency. "Elara, are you okay?" His anxious tone made my heart tighten. I turned to look and realized that the person was a stranger. Instinctively, I tried to struggle and resist, but suddenly a sharp pain surged through me as though it came from my knee. The pain was so intense I nearly cried out. Carefully, I gripped the boy's arm, trying to push myself up, but my body felt so weak that I lost strength almost immediately. "We need to go, don't be afraid, I'll get you out of here," the boy said, his voice trembling, clearly scared too. I didn't know him at all. I had no idea why I was here with him. What was worse, I had been sleeping in my dorm room, so how had I suddenly ended up in this place? "Who are you? How did I end up here?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. My mind was in chaos. The plot of the CEO novel my roommate had just mentioned echoing in my head. Suddenly, a few loud barks from wolves reached my ears, followed by hurried footsteps. I realized things were getting very bad, and the boy beside me became even more tense. "He found us," the boy whispered. Who found us?" I hurriedly asked, but the boy had already grabbed my arm and was pulling me forward. The barks were getting closer and I could almost feel their breath. "Don't stop, run," the boy urged anxiously. However, my knee was already injured and the pain was making my steps heavier and heavier. Just as I was about to collapse, several black-backed wolves suddenly charged toward us. I clung tightly to the boy's shirt, my fear almost overwhelming me. I couldn't bear to imagine what would happen next. We were almost running with all our strength, but the pain in my legs made it impossible for me to maintain my balance. The wolves were relentlessly chasing us, their footsteps drawing closer and closer, their breath seeming to carry the scent of death. A wave of dizziness hit me and I couldn't help but look down at my feet, suddenly feeling a suffocating pressure. "Don't stop. Hurry. We can't escape much longer." The boy's voice was full of urgency and unease. His hand gripped mine tightly as though if he let go, the wolves would catch up with us. I gritted my teeth and fought through the sharp pain in my knee, pushing forward. But with every step, it felt as though needles were being driven into my knee, pain nearly overwhelming me. But I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, the consequences would be unimaginable. Just then, a sharp wolf's howl pierced the air, followed by the rapid approach of several black-backed wolves. I turned around and saw them getting closer. Massive bodies, sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight, their hungry eyes locked onto us as if they had already marked us as their prey. I instinctively tightened my grip on the boy's hand. "Run, run," I yelled, my heart filled with despair. "Elara." The boy's voice trembled, his steps faltering, clearly hesitating in his own struggle. "Hurry. If we don't run now, it'll be too late." With all my strength, I shoved his hand away and ran forward, my heart pounding so fast I thought it might burst. My mind was blank, only the sound of the wolves' howls and my own breath filling my ears. Just then, I felt a shadow looming behind me. I turned quickly and saw one of the wolves leaping toward us. It was incredibly fast, reaching me in the blink of an eye. Panic flooded me and I nearly lost my footing. "Elara, get out of the way." The boy pushed me aside, positioning himself between me and the wolf. In that moment, I could hardly believe my eyes. Without hesitation, the wolf bit down on the boy's leg. He let out a painful growl, and it seemed as if the wolf was about to tear him apart. I barely had time to think. The only thought in my mind was, "I cannot let him die. Stop." I screamed, desperately grabbing the wolf's neck, trying to pull it off. But the wolf's strength was overwhelming and it was beyond my control. In my moment of despair, a cold, cutting voice echoed from behind us. "Enough." That voice was like a sharp blade, instantly silencing everything around us. The wolves froze and I turned to look. A figure stepped out from the shadows. He moved with an elegant stride, his gaze cold as if he had stepped out of hell itself. He was dressed in a black suit, with a black umbrella shielding his face from view, making him appear all the more mysterious. "Ronan Blackwood?" I almost instinctively called out his name. He didn't respond. Instead, he lowered his head slowly, shooting me a glance that was filled with disdain and mockery. He let out a low, cruel laugh, his voice cold as ice. "Thinking you can escape? You'll never get away." He walked so slowly, as if savoring the pressure of each step. I was being pushed forward by a few black-clad bodyguards, my steps slow and heavy. Every step felt suffocating, as though the air was being slowly sucked away, and my heart was pounding faster and faster. I could almost hear my frantic heartbeat. Finally, he stopped in front of me, his eyes scanning my face, cold and indifferent. In that moment, I felt a chill from head to toe, as if I were soaked in ice water. All my strength seemed drained. I knew this man was not ordinary. The aura around him was impossible to ignore, even making it hard to look him in the eye. "Are you still thinking of escaping?" Ronan Blackwood's voice was like a sharp blade, cutting coldly through the air. I lowered my head, afraid to look at him, my heart filled with fear and reluctance. I haven't escaped," I stammered, trying to sound calm, but his presence made it almost impossible to stay composed. He said nothing more, glancing down at my wrists, which the bodyguards were still holding. There was a brief flicker of interest in his eyes. He raised his hand and lightly waved, signaling the bodyguards to release me. My hands were free again, and the sharp pain in my wrists reminded me of how tightly he had almost choked me. "Elara Sinclair, so it's you." Ronan Blackwood's voice was low, tinged with a bit of amusement, his gaze seeming to see through all my fears and insecurities, cold and unfeeling. "You're not Elara Sinclair," he said, his tone icy, but the way he said it was filled with an undeniable threat. "But you look like her and your voice is the same. So what's the deal? Want to keep pretending to be her?" I raised my head, no longer looking down. In that moment, our eyes locked. His black eyes were devoid of warmth, only coldness that seemed to devour me whole. His gaze felt as though it could swallow my very being, making me feel insignificant. I wanted to resist, but his eyes drained me of all courage to fight back. "I'm not Elara Sinclair," I forced out, my voice so low it was almost inaudible. Ronan's eyes drifted over my face, and the corner of his mouth curled into a slight, dismissive smile. "Oh." He didn't seem surprised by my response. Instead, he smiled with a hint of amusement. "It doesn't matter if you deny it. Right now you are her." Ronan walked closer to me slowly, his gaze sweeping across my face, as if he were studying every detail of my features. I could feel the sharpness and depth in his eyes, as though he could see through my every small movement. "Your aura is different from hers," he suddenly said, his tone slightly critical. "The old Elara Sinclair had a stubborn and defiant spirit, but you seem a little different." A shock ran through me, and I could hardly hide my inner turmoil. I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze, my mind in disarray. Ronan had detected the difference between me and Elara Sinclair just from my aura and small details. Could he really see that I wasn't her? "What should I do?" "You even smell different," Ronan said with a soft chuckle, his smile carrying a cold edge. "Though your appearance is somewhat similar, your eyes and the energy around you are too different." He paused, as if waiting for me to react. "Did you really think you could fool me?" His gaze locked onto mine unblinkingly. At that moment, I could barely breathe. His insight was so sharp, I felt as if I couldn't hide anything from him. Ronan had seen right through the difference between me and Elara Sinclair. He knew I wasn't her. I was too scared to react any longer. My heart was filled with endless fear and despair. The man before me seemed to have decided my fate. I couldn't escape. He had seen through me and now controlled me. "You're clever," I whispered, humiliation and helplessness flooding my heart. "But what can you do now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved his gaze away from my face, as if I no longer interested him. "I don't care who you are," he said coldly. "You are Elara Sinclair. Even if you're not her, you're still mine. Remember, no matter who you are, you'll never escape my control." His voice was deep and cold, crushing me completely. I had no strength left to refute him. Ronan Blackwood had already decided my fate, and I would never escape him. The atmosphere between them crackled with tension as Ronan Blackwood paused, his cold gaze fixed on her, waiting for some kind of reaction. She struggled to maintain her composure, clenching her teeth and drawing a deep breath to force herself into a semblance of calm. "You're not going to let me go, are you?" she asked in a voice thick with anger and defiance. Ronan didn't answer immediately, only allowing a slight, disdainful smile to curve his lips. "Let you go?" he repeated, his voice like a cold blade cutting through the air. "Do you really think you can escape my control?" Her blood boiled with fury, the fire in her eyes nearly consuming her. Though fear still gnawed at her insides, she refused to be crushed under his oppressive dominance. She knew that the only chance she had to break free was to fight back. "You're wrong," she suddenly shouted, glaring at him with a fire she could hardly suppress. "I won't let you destroy me. I'm not Elara Sinclair, and I'm not going to be your puppet." Ronan's smile faded into something colder, his gaze sharpening with a flicker of interest. His fingers barely grazed her chin as he lifted her face to meet his. Her body tensed with the urge to retreat, but his eyes kept her frozen in place. "Do you really think you can be like her?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. You say you're not Alara Sinclair, but you look like her, sound like her, even think like her. You're just a replacement. The word replacement hit her like a physical blow. It felt like every word he spoke was a strike against her chest, suffocating her. Her eyes burned with the intensity of her defiance. I'm not her, she cried out, shaking with the force of her words. I didn't choose to be here, I didn't choose to replace her. Ronan didn't respond immediately. He simply regarded her with an air of detached amusement. You're brave, he observed, his voice almost amused. But what will your bravery change? You can only do what I allow you to do. Her anger flared again, every muscle in her body yearning to strike back, to show him that she wouldn't be dominated. I don't believe you, she retorted, her voice now strong and full of defiance. You just want to control me, but I won't cooperate. He fell silent for a moment before closing the distance between them, his towering presence making the air around her feel dense, suffocating. His breath was hot against her skin as he spoke, low and dangerous. You won't cooperate? His lips curved into a dark smile. Do you really think you have a choice? His hand reached up, gripping her chin with a strength that forced her head to tilt upward. Her body felt as though it were being pulled into his orbit, her resistance draining away in the face of his overpowering presence. You think you have a choice? He asked again, his voice like ice. You're just a substitute, and in the end I will decide your fate. Let me go, she screamed, the last of her strength pouring into the attempt to break free. I won't give in to you. Ronan's gaze flickered with something like amusement, as if her defiance intrigued him. You won't submit? He said, his voice quiet but laced with a dark thrill. Good. Your resistance makes me want to break your pride even more. With every ounce of willpower left in her, she shoved against his grip, her body trembling with effort. Though it felt as if her resistance would be crushed beneath the weight of his power, something inside her sparked. A surge of strength, of defiance that she hadn't expected. You can't control me, she shouted, her eyes alight with the flame of resolve. You will never make me bow down to you. For the first time, Ronan paused, his expression unreadable as he stared down at her. His lips curved into an icy smile, and his eyes glinted with a mixture of cold calculation and curiosity. All right, he said softly, his voice like a final, chilling promise. We'll see how long you can keep this up. With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart racing with the intensity of their encounter. But even as he disappeared from view, the fire inside her only burned brighter. She had made her stand and she would not give up, no matter what. That night, Ronan took me back to the mansion. The room was eerily quiet, the dim light casting long shadows as the air between us seemed thick with unspoken tension. Ronan didn't rush to do anything, merely remaining silent as if waiting for me to make the first move. I stood before him, fear and unease churning inside me, but I forced myself to remain composed. I don't want to be here. My voice trembled slightly, but I did my best to sound firm. You can't keep controlling me like this. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on me, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if every word I spoke was meaningless. Then he casually walked over to the sofa, lit a cigarette and took a slow drag. The smoke curled in the air, its oppressive presence almost suffocating. You don't want to be here? He finally spoke, his voice low and indifferent. Then where do you want to go? His gaze darkened, a strange interest flickering in his eyes. You don't want to stay here, but where can you go? Escape me? Do you really think you can escape? I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze. Every word from Ronan felt like invisible chains binding me in place. I fought the pessimistic thoughts and tried to steady myself. I don't want to be your pawn, I whispered, my voice faint but laced with defiance. You can't make me into whatever you want. His eyes grew even darker and a mocking smile curved his lips. Do you think you can decide? He murmured, his voice dripping with contempt. You're nothing but my property. I do as I please. The coldness in his smile sent a chill through me, as if his very presence threatened to consume me. My heartbeat quickened, my entire body tense with a rising wave of anxiety. Ronan's aura was too powerful, too overwhelming. It felt like every nerve in my body was being pulled by him. Suddenly, Ronan stood up and walked toward me. I instinctively took a step back, but my footing faltered and my heart raced as he drew nearer. His presence loomed over me and I could feel the weight of his coldness and authority. Do you think you can avoid me? He asked, his voice carrying an unmistakable air of finality. I glanced down at my trembling hands, noticing the way they clenched into fists, betraying my fear. My body stiffened as he closed the distance between us. I knew he was close enough that if he wished, he could have complete control over me. You shouldn't challenge me, his voice rumbled, a warning that felt like it cut straight through me. I suggest you don't resist unless you want to play a more interesting game with me. My mind was in turmoil, a storm of anger and fear clashing within me. But I didn't immediately fight back. Every thought seemed hazy, clouded by his overpowering presence. His words and aura consumed everything around me. Before I could even react, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward him with effortless strength. His movements were slow, yet they carried an undeniable force that left me unable to fight back. "You're not running away?" He looked down at me, his gaze colder than ever, and there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. I didn't answer. My head was lowered, trying to conceal the terror flooding my chest. Ronan seemed to sense the hesitation in me, his smile turning even colder, more taunting. "Do you really think you can control everything?" he murmured, closing in further. His voice was almost predatory, as if he relished every moment of my vulnerability. "Don't want to resist? Or have you already given up?" The weight of his words pressed down on me, each syllable filling the air with suffocating pressure. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my body inching closer to him against my will. Then, without warning, I felt his fingers lightly brush against my cheek. In that moment, his touch was cold and commanding, as if every gentle caress was a test of my resolve. I lifted my gaze to him, attempting to resist, but his eyes held me captive, locking me in place. I could barely stand the intensity of his gaze, but in that instant something inside me snapped. Ronan's every movement, every glance, felt like a trap that I couldn't escape from, and he was the one pulling the strings. "Are you afraid?" His voice remained calm, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized he wasn't merely trying to control me, he was trying to break my spirit entirely. I don't. My words caught in my throat, barely a whisper. Ronan's low laugh echoed in my ears, as if he could see straight through my inner turmoil. And then he leaned down, his lips brushing against my forehead. The kiss wasn't passionate, but it was heavy, laden with a possessiveness that made it impossible for me to breathe. My body trembled uncontrollably, unable to react. "You can't escape," he whispered softly, each word like a dark promise, filled with an unfathomable threat and ownership. His kiss slowly moved down to my chin, lingering on my lips for a moment before he pulled away, his presence still dominating the space. In that instant I was trapped. Ronan had become my cage and there was no way out. His kiss, cold and commanding, held no love, only the complete and utter control he wielded over me. Ronan's kiss left me almost breathless. In that moment all my emotions became a chaotic blur and even thinking seemed impossible. Although his kiss lacked any real tenderness and felt more like a cold proclamation, I could still feel the intense possessiveness emanating from him. It was as if he were telling me that I had no choice but to submit, and that escape was an impossible option. My body instinctively stiffened, unable to resist but also too afraid to fully relax. Every move he made seemed to challenge my limits, while every breath I took felt as if it were trapped by his presence. His hands seemed to leave marks on my body, reminders of his control over me that I couldn't ignore. He slowly pulled away, his lips curling into that cold, mocking smile, his gaze piercing and deep. "You can choose to resist, but you know resistance will only make me more interested," he said, his voice a low, shadowy whisper, carrying with it an undeniable blend of attraction and threat. I bit my lip, desperately trying to keep my composure, but my mind was filled with confusion and fear. I didn't want to yield, didn't want to become his plaything, but every time I came into contact with him, that invisible pressure nearly suffocated me. "Are you afraid?" Ronan's voice seemed to echo in my mind, that simple question carrying an icy weight. He reached out and gently squeezed my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. I could barely tolerate the coldness in his eyes, yet I couldn't look away. I'm not afraid," I whispered, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. I knew I couldn't fool him. He had already seen through every flicker of hesitation within me. "Good," he murmured, a low laugh escaping his lips. "You have courage." He released my chin, but something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "But courage doesn't mean you can escape." I couldn't respond. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he could hear it. I wanted to break free, but Ronan's presence was too overpowering. It felt as if he had claimed every inch of the room and there was no way out. All I could do was stand there at his mercy and let him control everything. In the past few days, Ronan seemed to be paying more attention to my state, as if he were deliberately observing my every move. Every time he appeared, his gaze held an unnerving scrutiny, like he was watching me, analyzing my every action. When I felt uneasy, he would fix his cold eyes on me, giving me no chance to escape. That day, I was sitting by the window trying to calm myself when I suddenly heard soft footsteps behind me. Ronan stood in the doorway, his gaze deep and unyielding. What are you thinking about? His voice was low and powerful. I forced myself to turn around, not daring to look at his face, but my heart was pounding uncontrollably. Nothing, I whispered, avoiding his eyes. Don't lie, he said, taking a few steps closer, standing in front of me. His eyes were sharp like knives. I know what you're thinking. After speaking, he reached out and lightly touched my shoulder. In that instant, my body tensed involuntarily. His touch was gentle, but it was enough to remind me of his control over me. He didn't rush to get closer, only standing there watching me, seemingly waiting for my response. Why are you doing this to me? I couldn't stop myself from asking, my voice barely audible, but I could feel the tremor in my heart. Ronan paused for a moment, a flicker of complex emotion flashing in his eyes. What do you think I've done to you? He finally spoke, his voice tinged with a barely perceptible hint of amusement. I didn't know how to respond, so I lowered my head, trying to hide the turmoil inside me. Ronan's eyes never left me, as if he were waiting for an answer. In that moment, I felt myself drawn to him, unable to escape the grip of his gaze. Suddenly, he reached out and gently tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. You can't escape, he whispered, his tone laced with possessiveness. I'll make you understand that all resistance is futile. In that moment, I finally understood the true meaning behind his words. He wasn't just trying to control me. He was telling me that I had already fallen too far under his grasp to ever escape. Ronan's presence had become an invisible chain around me. Every time he got closer, every time our gazes intertwined, it felt as though I were a bird trapped in a cage, unable to escape. That day, he suddenly appeared before me, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You haven't rested properly in a while, he said, his voice deep and controlled. You're coming with me to meet some people today. Without waiting for my response, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me gently but firmly out of the room. Wait, I instinctively tried to resist, but Ronan didn't stop. He merely turned his head, casting a cold glance at me. Where else can you go? He countered, his voice laced with mockery. Don't want to go? Do you really think you have a choice? His tone was sharp, almost like a challenge. I didn't resist any longer. Instead, I silently followed him, a swirl of conflicting emotions churning in my chest. Despite his cold indifference, I couldn't ignore the faint sense of concern that seemed to be hidden beneath his hard exterior. It was almost as though this concern was buried under a mask of cruelty, a mask that I couldn't fully understand. When we reached the car, Ronan stopped and suddenly turned to face me. You look exhausted, he said, his voice still deep and steady. I'll let you rest, but for now, come with me. I nodded, though a storm of emotions surged within me. I didn't understand why I agreed, but it was as if some invisible force was pushing me, telling me that rejecting him wasn't an option. That day, Ronan brought me to a secluded warehouse, its air thick with the smell of decay and neglect. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Ronan seemed in no rush to do anything to me. He walked ahead silently, occasionally glancing back at me. Each time our eyes met, my heart would inexplicably race, and despite my efforts to control myself, his presence was impossible to ignore. The ground of the warehouse was uneven, cluttered with debris in every corner. As we moved deeper inside, suddenly, a sharp piece of metal fell from a height, heading straight toward me. Instinctively, I tried to dodge, but the narrow space left me with little time to react. Just before the metal hit, I felt a powerful force yank me back and I was shoved to the ground. My back slammed against the cold floor, sending a sharp pain shooting through my body and momentarily clouding my senses. To my surprise, Ronan didn't do what I had expected, stand by coldly and watch. Instead, he moved swiftly, stepping in front of me and taking the blow of the metal piece with his own body. The metal hit him with a dull thud, and I barely had time to register the impact before I watched him bend forward, his face turning ashen. Though he didn't collapse, his body trembled slightly from the force of the blow. Ronan! I cried out in panic, immediately trying to scramble to my feet and rush toward him. Ronan didn't respond, silently standing up, his hand pressing against his back as his face turned pale. Don't come over here, he said coldly, though there was a faint rasp in his voice, showing that he had been seriously hurt. I froze, my heart gripped by guilt and unease. You're hurt. Why didn't you tell me? I stammered, my voice trembling. You didn't have to do this. He turned away from me without responding, his gaze focused on the first aid kit in his hands, as though searching for a way to tend to his injury. Though he tried to remain composed, his clenched jaw and increasing pallor revealed that the injury was no small matter. You need to see a doctor, I murmured again, anxiety clouding my thoughts. You shouldn't have done that for me. I don't need you to worry about me. Ronan interrupted, his voice still cold, tinged with anger. You don't get to decide anything. I instinctively wanted to argue, but looking at the strained expression on his face, I felt a tangle of emotions. This was the first time I had seen him so vulnerable. Despite his usual hard exterior, here he was, clearly enduring something he could hardly bear. He walked over to a nearby table, grabbing a bottle of alcohol and some bandages to tend to his wound. I stood by, unsure how to approach, unable to find the words. His eyes were fixed on his injury as he methodically applied the bandages. His words, however, carried no warmth. "Stop talking. Don't let anyone hear you. You should let someone else handle this," I whispered, my concern deepening, but I didn't dare move closer. He didn't acknowledge me, instead shooting me a cold glance. "Don't worry. I'll last longer than you think." I remained rooted in place, watching him grit his teeth as he finished applying the bandages. Ronan's coldness and his actions left me utterly confused. He was so powerful, so capable, yet here he was, taking such a risk for me. Why was he doing this? Was there something more behind this overprotectiveness? What was he really trying to protect? Once he finished, he turned to face me again, his eyes briefly flickering with something I couldn't quite identify before the usual indifference returned. "You shouldn't concern yourself with this," he said softly, as if warning me, or perhaps reminding himself. After Ronan finished tending to his wound, he stood there, his gaze completely devoid of any emotion. Though he seemed to be enduring pain, his cold indifference still enveloped him, like a shield he refused to drop. Just when I thought he might return to his usual demeanor, he suddenly looked at me, a flicker of something hard to read passing through his eyes. "You can leave now," he said flatly, his voice carrying no warmth, as though he were stating an unrelated fact. "I'm not leaving," I replied firmly, biting my lip. "You're hurt. I can't leave." Ronan's eyebrows furrowed slightly, clearly surprised by my response, but his expression quickly returned to indifference. "I don't need your concern," he said calmly, almost mechanically. Yet I could sense the weariness and unease hiding behind his words. He turned toward the window, staring out into the distance. In that moment, I saw the clear fatigue etched on his face. His body, though strong, was clearly bearing some invisible burden. Despite his cold and indifferent exterior, I began to understand that he was not as unaffected as he seemed. "Why are you so cold to me?" I couldn't help but ask, my voice low, tinged with uncertainty as I approached him. Ronan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to face me, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Cold?" He chuckled softly, almost mockingly. "Do you think I care about you?" I bit my lower lip, lowering my gaze as a wave of disappointment washed over me. The feeling was painful, but it was more a sense of helplessness than anything else. He didn't have any feelings for me. His coldness was just who he was. "Do you want to escape from me?" Ronan suddenly asked, his sharp gaze locking onto mine. "You think you can get away?" His words hit me like a lightning strike, freezing my heart. In that moment, I realized that despite my desire to rebel and break free from his control, I was beginning to understand that there was nothing I could do to change the situation. Ronan took a step closer, lowering his head, his eyes never leaving mine. "Don't you find yourself a little pathetic?" he said, his tone growing even colder. "Resistance is futile. You will eventually become a part of me." I won't surrender," I said through clenched teeth, trying my best to stay composed, though my heart was in turmoil. Ronan's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile, one that held a trace of mockery. "Surrender? You think you have a choice? You can't escape anymore." His words left me speechless, but inside I was battling a storm of defiance and frustration. Ronan's presence was like an insurmountable obstacle, trapping me in the cage he had built. Though I still longed for freedom, his dominance, his need to control, and his ever-present coldness were gradually drawing me deeper into this silent war. Taking a deep breath, I made a decision not to back down. Although I knew this was a battle without weapons, at least I wouldn't let myself be a mere pawn in his game. "You won't defeat me so easily," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. My heart was pounding, but I knew that now was the time to stand up to him. Ronan stopped in his tracks, staring at me for a long moment. I saw a flicker of something complicated in his eyes before his cold expression returned. "You think you can do something about it?" he asked, his voice soft but full of threat. I didn't answer. I simply looked at him with calm determination. Ronan, sensing my resolve, raised an eyebrow. "Are you really not afraid of dying?" "I'm not afraid of you," I repeated, the fire inside me growing stronger with each word. I realized that no matter what he threatened, no matter how cold he was, I couldn't run from this challenge anymore. Ronan didn't speak after that. His eyes grew distant, as if staring through me, lost in thoughts of his own. For a moment I felt like I understood. Behind his coldness there was pain, a pain he kept hidden, a secret he couldn't share. Perhaps like me, he had long since stopped being a mere opponent in this game. He suddenly turned and walked toward the window. The air seemed to grow heavy with silence, as if time itself had frozen for that one moment. I stood there, my heart full of complex emotions, but in the end I knew that I could no longer run from him. I would have to face him, to stand alongside him, in this world that had become ours, whether I liked it or not. The following days only deepened my confusion and unease, as Ronan's coldness and distance became even more palpable. Every time he appeared, his presence was overwhelming, yet between us, there was an invisible barrier I couldn't cross. Every glance, every encounter with him, made my heart race, as if some unseen force was binding me tightly. That day Ronan took me to the old warehouse again. However, this time he didn't take me for a deal. Instead, he left me alone in a dimly lit room. The thick curtains blocked out the light, and the entire room felt steeped in a heavy silence. It was as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. I stood in the corner of the room, staring out the window, my mind swirling with confusion and frustration. Ronan's coldness, his strength, and even his occasional care all made me feel conflicted and powerless. But what hurt the most was that Ronan seemed to be silently controlling everything. I couldn't escape, nor could I resist. "What are you thinking about?" Suddenly, Ronan's voice came from the doorway, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see him standing there, his gaze cold and assessing. I didn't answer, instead lowering my head as a strange wave of emotion began to rise within me. "Why did you bring me here?" I finally couldn't hold back the question, my voice tinged with unease. "What do you want me to do?" Ronan didn't answer right away. He simply stepped into the room and gave me a cold, appraising look. "Do you think you have a choice?" he said quietly, his tone devoid of warmth. "I have a choice," I said, lifting my head to meet his gaze, my resolve finally finding its voice. "I don't want to be a pawn in your game. Do you think you can escape?" Ronan's eyes sharpened, turning into a blade that seemed ready to break me down in an instant. "I'm not running," I said through clenched teeth, my voice low. "You don't allow me to have any choices, but I won't give up who I am." Ronan didn't respond immediately. He took a step closer to me. In that instant, it felt as if my heart stopped. It was as if the world had collapsed into the space between us. I could feel the pressure, the power radiating off him, but instead of advancing further, he stopped and stood there, silently watching me. "You think you can resist me?" He suddenly chuckled, his laugh laced with a hint of disdain. "You think you can control everything?" I didn't answer, my heart filled with a mix of doubt and unease. Ronan's cold indifference felt like an invisible net, trapping me in place. I tried to push against it, but the more I struggled, the more I felt ensnared. Suddenly, he reached out and placed his hand gently on my shoulder, guiding me to sit on the couch. "Stop resisting," he murmured, his voice carrying a hint of exhaustion that I hadn't noticed before. "You don't have to be so stubborn. Let go of your defenses and perhaps we can find a new way." I looked up at him in shock and confusion. "A new way?" I could hardly believe my ears. "You want me to submit?" Ronan's eyes deepened with complexity, as though weighing his next words carefully. "Submit?" he repeated softly, his voice now tinged with something more than mere control. "You already belong to me. Whether you submit or not, it doesn't matter anymore." In that moment, I felt suffocated. His words created a storm of confusion in my mind. I had always thought him cold and ruthless, determined to control everything. But now there was something more in his voice, something hard to grasp. Maybe, underneath his cold exterior, he was struggling with something he couldn't express. "You won't understand," Ronan's voice broke my reverie, his words almost a whisper. "But maybe in time things will change." I stood up and walked toward him, my heart pounding with unease, but I knew I could no longer avoid the truth. Ronan wasn't as heartless as he appeared. Every word, every action, seemed to hold layers of complexity, hidden meanings that I couldn't fully comprehend. "I don't understand," I said softly, my voice tinged with confusion. "Why are you doing this to me?" Ronan's gaze softened just a little, as if he saw the confusion in my eyes. He sighed deeply, his expression briefly showing vulnerability. "Because you have already become a part of me," he whispered. "Even if you refuse to admit it, this connection between us has already formed." My heart raced, and suddenly it felt like everything clicked into place. It wasn't just control. It wasn't just power over me. There was something deeper. A connection I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. It was as if, no matter how much I resisted, this bond between us had already taken root and was impossible to sever. In that moment I knew. I couldn't run from him anymore. Whether I liked it or not, I was already entangled in this fate with him. That day, Ronan didn't leave immediately as he usually did. Instead, he stayed in the room as if waiting for something. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, and I stood before him, filled with questions and unease. He sat at the table, his gaze deep and distant as though lost in thought. while I remained standing, hesitant to break the silence. His cold stare always made me feel trapped, but in that moment I sensed some kind of shift in him. Something subtle beneath his exterior. "You're always so silent," I finally spoke, my voice low. "You never tell me what you're thinking." Ronan lifted his head, his eyes still cold. "Do you think you need to know?" he replied flatly, as though he were reminding me that some things were none of my business. I bit my lip, feeling a twinge of conflict within myself. "Why are you doing this to me?" I couldn't hold back the question. "You could just make me leave, so why keep me here?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He remained silent for a moment, as if weighing whether to reveal something I wasn't supposed to know. Finally, he sighed and spoke in a low voice, as if from deep within himself. "You don't know what you are," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "You're something I can't control." "What?" I was stunned. "What do you mean by that?" Ronan's gaze grew even more complex. "You're not a Lara Sinclair," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But you're almost like her." He paused, as though lost in a memory. "Some of the qualities you have are exactly like hers." My heart skipped a beat, as if struck by a heavy blow. "Lara Sinclair? That person?" I was at a loss, struggling to comprehend his words. Seeing my confusion, Ronan continued, his voice steady. "She was the one person I could never truly let go of. And you, despite being a substitute for her, you carry her essence. Are you saying I'm just a substitute?" My voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Ronan's gaze remained as cold as ever. "You don't understand," he said, tilting his head slightly. "In many ways you're exactly like her. In fact, you confuse me more than she ever did." I couldn't fully grasp what he was saying. Was he really seeing me as her replacement? I had never chosen to become part of her world, nor did I want to be bound by the shadow of the past. "Is that how you feel about her?" I asked suddenly, my voice rising with emotion. "You see me as her image, to be controlled at will?" Ronan looked at me, his coldness unwavering. "I never asked you to be her," he said, his voice low but firm. "But your presence forces me to confront a past I didn't want to face. You are her image, yet you also have something of your own." I stopped, suddenly overwhelmed with a wave of helplessness. "You've always tried to control me, but you can't let go of her," I said softly, a hint of pity in my voice. "Ronan, why are you doing this?" Ronan didn't answer right away. Instead, he lowered his head as if lost in thought. "Sometimes the past is something that can't be completely forgotten," he murmured, his voice raspy, as if he were speaking about a painful history. I stood there, emotions swirling in my chest. Ronan's coldness and distance had hidden a far more complex past. He wasn't entirely heartless. Deep down, he seemed to be struggling with some kind of unresolved pain. "So is that why you're treating me this way?" I spoke slowly, my voice tinged with sadness. "You see me as her image, unable to let go of the past, right?" Ronan didn't respond directly. He simply gazed at me, his eyes flickering with an emotion I couldn't quite place. For the first time, I felt like maybe his feelings for me weren't purely about control. There was something more, something I couldn't yet understand. I took a deep breath and lowered my head. "I don't want to be her replacement," I said, my voice resolute. "I just want to be myself." Ronan walked closer to me, lowering his head as well. His gaze was deeper, more complicated than I had ever seen. "You can be yourself," he said, his tone softer than before. "But you can't change the fact that my feelings for you are no longer simple." His words hit me like a thunderclap, piercing through my heart. Ronan's feelings weren't as cold and detached as I had thought. What he felt for me was far more complicated, deeper than I had ever imagined. A few days later, Ronan took me to a private villa, and the exterior was completely different from his usual cold image. There were no steel and glass hardness. Instead, it was filled with a classical and cozy atmosphere. Every piece of furniture, every painting felt warm and tranquil, which made me feel somewhat out of place. Ronan seemed unaware of the turmoil inside me. He walked straight to a sofa in the center of the living room, sat down, and gently patted the seat beside him. "Come sit," he said softly, his tone not as cold as usual. "I have something to tell you." I hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat across from him. Ronan's gaze remained deep, but the coldness was tinged with a barely noticeable weariness. He didn't speak right away, just quietly watched me as if he was thinking about something. "Why don't you ask me why I brought you to this place?" he suddenly asked in a low voice. I hesitated but decided to break the silence. "Do you want me to ask?" He gave a slight smile, one that didn't bring warmth but rather added a touch of coldness. "Of course you don't want to ask, but some things you will eventually need to know." He paused and then said, "You look just like her." "Who?" I asked, an uneasy feeling rising in my chest. "Lara Sinclair." Ronan's voice was calm but carried an undeniable pain. You look exactly like her, even your aura is similar. Sometimes I can't help but think of her. What are you saying? My voice trembled. Though I already had a premonition, I still couldn't stay calm. Ronan's eyes softened as if recalling something. She is the only person I truly can't let go of. He spoke slowly, his tone filled with helplessness and pain. You look like her, but you're not her. I listened quietly, but my heart was filled with doubt. She meant a lot to you, didn't she? I asked softly. Ronan didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the empty garden outside. His silhouette stretched long in the sunlight, looking lonely and distant. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. We worked together for a long time, and there were some things no one knew. His voice grew quieter. Our relationship wasn't just that of work partners. We were deeply reliant on each other. She saved me, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. She saved you. My heart jolted, not expecting Ronan to have experienced such heavy emotions. Is there something you couldn't get over between you and her? Ronan turned his head, a flash of pain in his eyes as if recalling something deeply hidden in his heart. There are indeed some things between us that I can't get past, he said softly. Alara Sinclair gave up a lot for me. She almost lost herself to protect me. At that time, we stood together and faced every hardship. Can you imagine that kind of power? She showed me what anything for the other person truly meant. I listened to his words, my heart shaken. I couldn't believe how important Alara Sinclair had been to Ronan. What about her now? Is she still around? Ronan's gaze grew more complicated, as if recalling something he didn't want to speak of. She's not here anymore, he answered softly, his tone laced with an almost imperceptible sadness. She gave her life to save me. I could never save her, and even now I can't forget. His voice grew softer, and I could hardly hear his words. I could only feel the deep pain in his eyes. Behind Ronan's coldness, there was an indelible past, a weight of memories that made him so complex and unreachable. So that's why you've been so cold to me? I asked softly, suddenly understanding something. Is it because I look like her, or because you can't escape her image? Ronan didn't answer, just quietly stared at me with a complex expression. After a long silence, he sighed lightly. You look like her, and I can't ignore you, but you're not her. You're someone else, completely different. At that moment, I seemed to understand. Ronan's coldness wasn't rejection of me personally, but his deep memory of Alara Sinclair. He had been struggling with the pain of the past and emotions he couldn't let go of. I, unfortunately, had become an unavoidable part of that past. A few days later, Ronan seemed to relax his control over me. Although his coldness remained unchanged, he no longer pressured me for responses as frequently. I found that I had more freedom, able to wander around this isolated island and take in the surrounding environment and sights. During the day, the sea breeze brushed against my face, and at night, the sky was filled with a blanket of stars. Still, Ronan's shadow never truly left. Whenever I walked alone on the island, my mind inevitably drifted back to my conversations with Ronan, especially the words he had said. You look like her, but you're not her. These words cut deep, like a heavy knife, leaving an indelible mark in my heart. I wasn't completely sure of Ronan's true purpose for bringing me here, but I knew one thing for certain. He still hadn't let go of Alara Sinclair. The depth of that emotion seemed to have taken root in his heart, something that couldn't be erased. That day, I returned to the beach and stood at the edge of a cliff. The sea wind lifted my hair, howling as it blew past me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard familiar footsteps behind me. Ronan slowly approached, still maintaining his usual cold demeanor. How long have you been here? I asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ronan stood beside me, his eyes complex as he gazed into the distance. Maybe it's been a long time, he replied, his voice low, carrying an emotion that was hard to pinpoint. But I've never truly let her go. I didn't respond, merely standing in silence, my gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The surface of the sea shimmered, as if the entire world was flowing before my eyes. I knew that Ronan's past was still deeply embedded in his heart. No matter how hard I tried to reach him, his heart remained so distant. Are you afraid of losing her? I finally couldn't hold it in any longer and asked, my heart full of confusion and complex emotions. Ronan paused for a moment and glanced at me. Losing her? A bitter flash crossed his eyes. She's already gone. How can you talk about losing her again? I lowered my head, feeling a sense of suffocation, but I understood. Ronan's pain didn't just stem from losing Alara Sinclair. It was because he had never truly let go of that relationship. Her departure had left an unhealable wound in his heart. Why don't you let go? I asked softly, my eyes still on the sea. If she's no longer here, why do you still let her occupy everything in your life? Ronan looked at me for a while as though considering my words. He sighed gently. Some things can't be forgotten. His voice was soft but filled with deep resignation. She appeared in my darkest time and brought me light. She did so much for me I can never forget. What about me? I couldn't help but ask, filled with confusion. If you can't let go of her, then what am I? Ronan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lowered his head, falling silent. His gaze grew more complicated, as if I had touched on his deepest pain. You're not her, he whispered. You're completely different from her. But I'm here too, I softly replied, my voice tinged with helplessness. I have my own thoughts, my own emotions. I don't exist to replace her. Ronan's gaze softened slightly and he slowly turned toward me. I know, he said, his tone deep. You're not her. You have your own value. I don't want you to be her shadow, but your resemblance to her makes it hard for me to ignore. His words tightened something in my chest. Ronan's emotions were tangled and complex. Clearly, he hadn't fully let go of Alara Sinclair, but at the same time he was starting to realize that the relationship between her and me wasn't merely a replacement. He was beginning to see me as someone with my own unique presence. I fell silent for a while before speaking up. Are you always running away? Running away from the pain of losing her, running away from your true feelings? Ronan didn't answer me. Instead, he turned around and softly said, You don't understand. His voice was gentle but carried an unspoken weight. It's not that I don't want to let go, I'm just afraid of losing again. I stopped talking, simply watching him. His heart was filled with contradictions and struggles, and no matter what, I could never fully comprehend his complex emotions. Ronan never let anyone see his vulnerability, and even he himself couldn't face the deep pain inside. At that moment, Ronan suddenly turned to look at me. Do you want to know why I have such complicated feelings toward you? I was stunned, not knowing how to respond. I had only been by his side, living under the shadow he cast, but his words shook me to my core. Because you... He paused, his eyes growing deep. You remind me of her, but you're not her. You're another person, but the image of her in you is something I can't escape. I was left speechless, my heart filled with conflicting emotions. In Ronan's eyes, it seemed as though there was so much pain and so many unresolved secrets. No matter what I did, I could never reach the depths of his heart. That day, Ronan took me to his family's old estate, a place almost isolated from the world. Surrounded by dense woods, it exuded an eerie stillness. The air was thick with the weight of history, as if time itself had stalled here. Ronan and I walked into the house, and the quiet surrounding us made me feel uneasy. This place didn't feel like any other. It seemed to hide some secrets. Ronan didn't rush to speak, but instead walked ahead, his expression tense. We passed through a quiet hall and finally reached an ancient living room. The furniture was old, worn by the passage of time. As I looked around, a sudden sound of footsteps came from outside the door, and a stranger appeared at the entrance. The man was around 40, dressed sharply, and carried an undeniable aura. His gaze toward Ronan was deep, filled with some unspoken emotion. Mr. To, you've finally come, the man said faintly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment. Ronan's face shifted. Clearly, he hadn't expected to encounter this person here. Who are you? Ronan's voice was cold, tinged with suspicion. We have some old matters to discuss, the man replied calmly, but not right now. You need to hear what I have to say, Mr. To. Ronan's face grew even more serious, clearly displeased by the unexpected appearance. I don't have time, he said coldly, his tone sharp. If there's nothing new, I'm not wasting time. Do you really think you can forget the past? The man took a step forward, not in a rush to leave. You think burying everything here will help you escape? Ronan didn't answer immediately. He simply gave the man a cold look, his brows furrowing, clearly troubled by some hidden matter. But despite that, he didn't show any signs of panic. The atmosphere between them became oppressive, as if the conversation itself was filled with hostility and complex emotions. I stood quietly to the side, my mind filled with questions. Although the man didn't show any direct threat, I could feel Ronan's tension and unease, an emotion completely different from his usual calm and toughness. What do you want me to do? Ronan finally spoke, his voice low and strained, as if he could no longer maintain his calm demeanor. The man stood still, a flicker of complexity in his eyes. You know, you can never escape the past, he said, walking over to the window and looking out at the silent woods. I know you've been trying to hide, but we both know that some things cannot be erased. Ronan's gaze grew even colder. What exactly are you trying to say? His voice was filled with an undeniable threat. I stood there, silently observing, and my understanding of Ronan began to deepen. Although he maintained his cold and cautious exterior with others, I could feel the turmoil within him. This emotion was clearly tied to some deep-seated secret from his past. The man's words also confirmed that Ronan wasn't just the strong figure he appeared to be. His heart still carried unspoken pain. "You have to make this decision yourself," the man finally said, a hint of disdain in his eyes. "But you don't have many choices left." As his words faded, Ronan stood silently for a few seconds before suddenly turning away. "Let's go." The man didn't ask any more questions but slowly left the room, leaving the two of us standing there. Ronan's back seemed unusually lonely, and in that moment, I glimpsed a side of him that no one knew, vulnerable and uncertain beneath the tough exterior. I didn't speak immediately, instead standing quietly, feeling the heaviness in the air. Eventually I walked up to Ronan. "Can you tell me who he is?" Ronan remained silent for a while, clearly reluctant to bring up the past. "He was my former partner," he finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual hardness. "We went through a very difficult time together. But there seems to be unresolved issues between you two," I said softly. Ronan didn't answer but gazed out the window. At that moment, I realized he wasn't willing to revisit that part of his history. Despite his efforts to remain cold and strong, the shadows of the past clearly still held sway over him. "You don't need to keep hiding from yourself," I said gently. "You don't have to bury all the pain inside." Ronan turned his head, his eyes filled with complexity. He didn't answer but sighed softly as if tired. "I don't need anyone's sympathy," he said coldly. "You don't need to worry." I looked at him, knowing he didn't want to let go of the pain from his past. But I also understood that he was no longer the man who could control everything. His heart was filled with too many unsolved mysteries, and I was beginning to realize that perhaps I could be the one to help him lower his defenses. The sudden appearance of the mysterious man revealed a hint of subtle fatigue beneath Ronan's usually composed exterior. We stayed at the estate for a few days, and it was clear that the man's arrival had placed Ronan in some sort of predicament. Despite maintaining his cold demeanor, I could tell that deep inside he was wrestling with some unresolved conflicts and contradictions. A few days later, I noticed that Ronan had grown increasingly silent, even neglecting the usual details he would never overlook. His gaze often appeared vacant, as if he were lost in thought over something difficult to express. I knew with certainty that this situation had deeply affected him. That night, Ronan finally spoke to me. "He's here," he murmured, his voice low. "His demands won't be easy to handle." I didn't ask for specifics about the demands, simply nodding quietly. Clearly, Ronan didn't want to reveal too much, but from his words I could sense his underlying anxiety. In the following days, Ronan's conversations with the mysterious man became more frequent. I tried to intervene, but he firmly stopped me. "You don't understand these things," he said bluntly. "I have to solve this myself." But I didn't give up. Through my observations over these few days, I began to realize that Ronan's attitude wasn't as resolute as he made it appear. Though he acted cold and detached, I knew this situation was likely more complicated for him than he let on. One night, during a late conversation, Ronan finally revealed the truth to me. The mysterious man had once been a business partner of his family, but their relationship had fractured after a failed business decision. A few years ago, the man had made an unreasonable demand. He wanted Ronan to help him pay off a massive debt. If Ronan refused, he would expose the family's secrets, which involved illegal transactions and a dark history tied to Ronan's family. "That's why you've never wanted to face him," I finally understood. Ronan's calmness and resilience had been shaped by the shadow of this history. "I'm powerless," Ronan's voice held a note of helplessness. "Once this is exposed, the entire family will collapse." "Do you think it's impossible to solve?" asked my tone firm. "You don't have to carry this alone." Ronan looked at me, his eyes flickering with complexity. "I can't let you get involved in this. Can't you see?" I met his gaze. "You're not alone anymore. This isn't just about your family, it's about you. You don't have to bear the burden on your own again." Ronan's eyes widened slightly, as if my sudden words had struck a chord. Then he closed his eyes for a moment, fell silent, and finally spoke. "You want to help me?" "Of course," I whispered. "You don't have to carry the weight of the past anymore." So Ronan decided to take a different approach to handle the situation. After several days of strategizing and discussing, we decided to first address the mysterious man's debt, then use information warfare and economic leverage to threaten him. Ronan had accumulated a powerful network in the financial and business sectors, and I, with my keen observation and analytical skills, provided him with practical strategies. In the end, we set a clever trap, making the mysterious man fall into a predicament during an unsuspecting transaction. By leveraging external economic forces, we sabotaged his original deal and forced him to accept our terms. The mysterious man reluctantly agreed to Ronan's terms, and the threat of exposing the secrets of Ronan's family was finally resolved. During the final negotiations, Ronan stood beside me, his expression calm and resolute. In that moment, I knew that not only had we overcome this external threat, but we had also taken another step toward mutual understanding and trust. "You did well," Ronan finally spoke, his gaze softening a little. "I didn't expect you to think of all this. You once showed me a side of you no one else knew," I replied softly. "Now, I hope you can see the real me." He looked at me, a flicker of warmth in his eyes, then quietly said, "Thank you, Alara. I never imagined that I would have a place for you in my heart." Those words filled me with warmth. Ronan had finally broken through the impenetrable coldness of his past, and he was starting to accept me as a true part of his life, not just as someone he once used to replace something or someone else. As the mysterious man's threat was neutralized, the dynamic between Ronan and me began to subtly shift. We were no longer merely two people who relied on each other and tested one another. Instead, we started moving toward a deeper understanding and a quiet harmony. That evening, Ronan invited me to have a drink with him on the terrace. He looked at me, his eyes soft but carrying an undercurrent of complex emotions. "You know," he said softly, his voice warm and sincere, "you've shown me more possibilities. I never thought I could rely on someone, especially not on you." I smiled slightly, my eyes shining with determination. "I've always been here by your side, never leaving." Ronan gently took my hand, and in that moment, it seemed that he no longer felt bound by his past, no longer afraid to give me a part of himself. His inner world began to open up, and I too started to understand the reasons behind his stubbornness and vulnerability. This relationship had finally reached a turning point, not just in the emotional bond between us, but in Ronan's acceptance and liberation of his own heart. The Ronan family's business empire had withstood many years of turbulence, but the most recent betrayal almost destroyed all his efforts. As Ronan's family power continued to grow, external hostile forces became increasingly active, and internal corporate battles grew more complex. Longtime friends and business partners of Ronan this time chose betrayal. This decision, though quiet, brought irreversible consequences. By the time Ronan noticed something was wrong, some of his shares had already been quietly transferred, and the cash flow had been subtly cut off. Clearly, the hostile forces had already extended their reach into Ronan's company. Former partners, ruthless in the face of profit, had allied with external forces, planning to gradually erode Ronan's business empire by manipulating shareholders and financial flows. Although Ronan remained calm, from the furrow of his brow and the faint tension at the corners of his mouth, I could sense his inner anxiety. We walked together toward the company headquarters, each of his steps heavy. Even though he was the head of the family, the changes were clearly making him feel helpless. "These people really think I won't retaliate?" he said in a low voice with a cold fury. "I never imagined someone would dare to strike at me." I stood beside him, looking down at his silent back, feeling uneasy. His coldness deeply hid his anger and betrayal by these people, and I knew this war would be far more complex than he had imagined. When we arrived at the company, Ronan decided to handle the crisis himself. He planned to hold an emergency meeting with shareholders and partners, hoping to turn the situation around through negotiations. However, everything had already been set up as a trap by the enemy. As the meeting began, Ronan calmly explained his plans for the company's future and proposed his solutions. However, things didn't go as expected. At the final crucial moment, a man in a suit suddenly appeared from behind the scenes, his eyes gleaming with a mocking smile, shattering the calm of the meeting. "Ronan, you may not realize it, but your company no longer belongs to you." The man's words hit like a cold blade in my heart, his tone full of disdain. "From this moment on, the ownership has already transferred." I abruptly looked up in shock, seeing the brief flicker of disbelief cross Ronan's face, before his gaze turned more resolute. Ronan paused for a moment, then slowly spoke. "You think this will make you win?" But the situation was far more complicated than we had imagined. This wasn't just a corporate conspiracy. It was a life-and-death battle involving family and personal interests. Former partners, using private deals and influence between shareholders, had secretly taken control of the company and began forming alliances with external financial powers. Even more infuriating to Ronan, they had already leaked part of the family's business secrets to the outside world, trying to force him to compromise. "You never thought you'd be schemed against like this, did you?" the man sneered. "Today is the day your end." As the situation became increasingly dangerous, Ronan decided to negotiate with the hostile forces alone. He knew that if he didn't do this by himself, the crisis might never calm down. He took a deep breath, looked at me, and his eyes were filled with determination. "Alara, I have to deal with this on my own. You and the others need to leave." I understood that this was not just for his family but also for himself. Ronan had never shown me his vulnerable side, but in that moment he was no longer the cold, invincible man. He was someone standing at the front lines, willing to face danger without hesitation to protect his family and himself. The secret negotiations surprisingly didn't take as long as expected. It seemed that, in the end, both sides reluctantly reached some sort of agreement. However, just as Ronan was leaving the meeting room, something unexpected happened. What seemed like an ordinary meeting had been secretly arranged by the hostile forces as a trap. On his way out of the company, several men in black suddenly appeared and attacked. Everything happened too fast. Ronan was almost instantly surrounded by the attackers. He reacted quickly, trying to fight back with all his strength, but with multiple enemies coming at him unexpectedly, he and his bodyguards were clearly overwhelmed. Almost as soon as he reacted, one of the men in black swung a knife at him. Time seemed to freeze. I watched as the blade rapidly moved toward Ronan's abdomen. He barely had time to dodge, and the blade pierced through his clothes, embedding deep into his body. Blood spurted out instantly, staining his entire body. Ronan lost his balance and fell to the ground. His face quickly turned pale, and he pressed his hands tightly against the wound, but the blood continued to pour out uncontrollably. "Ronan!" I screamed, my heart breaking. Everything in front of me seemed to take away my breath, and tears blurred my vision. Ronan, the man who had never bowed his head, was now lying in a pool of blood, his life seemingly slipping away in an instant. I didn't stop running, wanting to rush to him, but a bodyguard who suddenly appeared beside me quickly grabbed my arm. "Miss Alara, please stay calm. Mr. Blackwood has ordered that your safety must be ensured at all costs," the bodyguard said urgently, his voice firm yet filled with clear concern. He quickly pulled me aside, preventing me from moving forward. I tried to break free, but I felt an inexplicable force holding me back. Ronan's condition was growing more critical, and all I could do was stand there, helpless, watching. My heart felt like it was being torn apart, each second dragging on like an eternity. The arrival of reinforcements helped Ronan regain control of the chaotic situation. He struggled to hold himself upright, his weak eyes fighting to focus. In the midst of the chaos, he remained the one in command. His voice was hoarse, but every word he uttered carried the weight of authority, pressing down with immense power. "Withdraw." Ronan's voice was barely audible, weak with exhaustion and pain, as if all his strength was gradually fading away. I felt his eyes barely open, trying to focus on me. In that moment, I saw the reluctance and determination in his gaze. Despite the immense pain, Ronan still held on, using every last bit of his strength to command the retreat. When he finally reached me, the air seemed to freeze in that instant. I could feel his shallow breaths, and with the last of his strength, he whispered, "Don't be afraid." His words were like a soft breeze, yet in that moment they struck me with the force of a storm. That feeling was deeper than any physical pain. Ronan, the man who never showed weakness to anyone, was now depending on me, entrusting all his vulnerability to me. I took his hand, unable to hold back the tears that welled up in my eyes, and they fell onto the back of his hand. "I'll be by your side," I whispered in reply, my eyes filled with an unspoken resolve and pain. I knew that in this moment I couldn't let him be alone. I couldn't let him give up. The support team quickly helped us evacuate. Ronan was on the brink of losing consciousness, and I held him tightly, feeling the weight of his body. I knew he would survive this test of life and death, but I couldn't let go of any hope because I believed in him. No matter how difficult it got, we would get through it together. With the bodyguard's swift actions, Ronan was finally escorted into his private car in the underground garage. Inside the car, his consciousness began to fade, and blood seeped through his clothes, staining the entire seat. The car sped off at breakneck speed, and I felt dizzy as though the whole world was spinning. "Ronan, don't sleep." I choked, holding his hand. The fear in my heart made every second feel like an eternity. The car raced toward his private hospital, and I could hardly breathe, my mind fixated on one thought. No matter what, he couldn't leave like this. I fought back tears, staying by his side until he was quickly rushed into the operating room. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the door as it closed behind him. I knew that, in this moment, it wasn't just his life that was at stake, but the ultimate test of everything we had fought for. Ronan was quickly rushed to the emergency room of his private hospital. Despite the world-class medical facilities and his personal doctor already being on standby, the situation was still deeply unsettling. Outside the operating room, the hours of waiting felt like an entire century, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. In the hospital corridor, several of Ronan's core team members were on the phone, their faces filled with anxiety and worry. They paced back and forth, waiting for the most crucial moment. Ronan was their leader, the pillar of the family. Without his guidance, they were like ships lost without a course. When will Mr. Ronan wake up? How do we handle the external situation? one of the core members asked anxiously, his voice laced with obvious tension. The surgery is still ongoing. We won't know what to do next until Mr. Ronan wakes up. Another member replied softly, clearly unsettled. At that moment, the whole hospital seemed to be shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere. I stood quietly in the corner of the hospital room, watching everything unfold, my mind weighed down with pressure. Though my rational mind told me to stay calm, I couldn't suppress the panic in my heart every time the operating room door opened and closed. Ronan was so strong, so confident. Why did fate have to play such cruel tricks on him? I had become accustomed to his steady gaze, his commanding presence, but today all I could do was stand there, unable to do anything. The doctors were constantly in and out, and Ronan was still on the operating table. It was clear that his injuries were severe and the situation was critical. I clenched my hands tightly, trying to suppress my own fear. Finally, the operating room door opened and several doctors emerged. Their faces were still grim, indicating that the surgery had not gone smoothly. His injuries are too severe. Although he is no longer in immediate danger, he will need long-term observation and recovery. The doctor paused for a moment, speaking in a low voice. He has lost a lot of blood and his internal organs have been severely damaged. He's still in a coma and we don't know when he'll wake up. I took a deep breath, but the worry in my heart didn't dissipate. Days passed and Ronan remained unconscious, the air in the hospital thick with tension. Every core member of Ronan's team appeared extremely anxious, fully aware that without Ronan to lead them, the family and the company were facing unprecedented challenges. The shareholders are becoming more and more demanding. We need to make a decision quickly, one of the core members said urgently in the office, his voice filled with anxiety. But what can we offer to guarantee they will keep their promises? Another member countered. With Mr. Blackwood absent, the power vacuum has already been noticed, and almost every shareholder has their own vested interests. How can we ensure no one will try to take advantage of this opportunity? Exactly. We can't keep delaying. Another member interjected. It's time to take action. Use legal measures to forcibly reclaim control. Their argument grew more heated, with various plans being proposed, but there was a clear lack of a unified decision. The situation seemed particularly chaotic, with everyone defending their own ideas but no one offering a clear solution to break the deadlock. I stood quietly in the corner of the meeting room, silently observing it all. Ronan's absence left everyone at a loss, and it seemed as if everyone was trying to take more speaking power, yet no one could come up with a rational solution to break the impasse. Your arguments will only make things more complicated, I suddenly spoke, interrupting their discussion. My voice was soft but carried undeniable authority. Everyone wants to secure the greatest benefits for themselves, but now is not the time for that. We must remain calm and come up with a global response strategy, just as Ronan would have handled things. I slowly walked to the conference table, my gaze calm and determined. Ronan never relied solely on individual opinions but always focused on the details and how to lay out a plan. He thought in terms of the overall long-term sustainability, not short-term quick gains. Right now, you're all caught up in small disputes over individual issues, but the most important thing we need to do is stabilize the current situation by unifying our direction. The atmosphere in the room was silent for a few seconds, and several core members turned their gaze toward me, clearly still processing my words. But I continued. First, we must unify our stance and make our attitude clear to all shareholders. Mr. Blackwood once said, at critical moments, only unity can ensure we stand undefeated against external pressures. If we divide ourselves now, we won't be able to handle any changes that may come. I paused for a moment, then spoke softly. Secondly, regarding the shareholders, we must be clear that even if it means short-term sacrifices, we cannot make concessions. In Ronan's name, we must propose to re-sign the shareholder agreements to ensure all decisions are made under a unified framework. Only by doing so can we prevent external forces from tearing apart the family by splitting the shareholders. Finally, regarding the issue of financial flows, I turned to another core member. We must temporarily freeze all unknown financial movements and clearly inform external forces that any attempt to manipulate our decisions through financial control will be met with a strong legal counterattack. The room fell silent once again, and the expressions of several core members became more complex. I could see that their anxiety was gradually being replaced by rationality, but they still didn't immediately agree with my proposal. The atmosphere became tense once more. At this moment, Ronan's personal bodyguard, codenamed X, silently entered the meeting room and stood by my side. X didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood calmly, exuding a steady and powerful aura. The core members of the team, surprised by his sudden appearance, exchanged glances. They all knew X's identity, but his presence at this moment only added more pressure on them. X calmly scanned everyone in the room before speaking in a composed manner. I know you're all discussing how to handle the current situation, but no matter what, today's decision will be executed in the name of Ronan. He paused for a moment and then continued. Mr. Blackwood instructed me to ensure Alara's safety, and he's shared much with me about his matters with Alara. No one understands his intentions better than I do except for me. With that, X slowly took a finely crafted metal token from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a token personally designed by Ronan, engraved with the family crest. This token was the highest symbol of authority that Ronan had given to X, representing his supreme position within the family. X then looked at me calmly and added, Miss Alara, I'm not just a bodyguard. My other role is as Mr. Blackwood's personal steward. He then turned his gaze to the others in the room and stated, From this moment on, anyone who opposes Alara opposes Mr. Blackwood. Her decisions are Mr. Blackwood's decisions. His voice was deep and powerful, filled with authority. The room fell into a deep silence, and the faces of several core members shifted slightly, but they quickly composed themselves. X's identity and the token in his hand gave me an undeniable authority. Since that's the case, we'll abide by Miss Alara's decisions. One core member finally spoke, his tone tinged with reluctance but unable to oppose any longer. Good, I nodded firmly, my gaze unwavering. From now on, everything will be carried out in the name of Mr. Blackwood. If there are no more objections, we will execute immediately. After the meeting, although some dissatisfaction still lingered, Ronan's core team had already begun to follow my instructions. X's support gave me tremendous confidence. At some point, I realized that I had begun to hope I could stand side by side with Ronan, so that he no longer had to bear everything alone. During the days of Ronan's unconsciousness, time seemed unusually long. Although we concealed the fact of his condition and managed to stabilize the operations of the family and company for the time being, I knew that this stability was fragile. Every decision I made had to be carried out in Ronan's name, as I did my best to uphold everything he had built. In these uncertain days, I was not only managing the affairs, but also constantly reflecting on my relationship with Ronan. Ronan was no longer just the distant, unreachable boss. He had become more real, closer, and more complex. Each decision I made, each choice I made while standing in his position, seemed to bring me closer to him. Miss Alara, Mr. Blackwood has always shouldered everything alone, X had once said to me on a quiet night, his voice deep. He has never easily relied on anyone. But he's different with you. He truly hopes you'll stay with him and become his pillar. I lowered my head, feeling conflicted. I understood the deeper meaning in X's words. Ronan's loneliness and the responsibilities he bore made it difficult for him to entrust himself to anyone. But now Ronan had allowed me into his world, giving me his trust. And I was beginning to understand the softer side of the cold and resilient man. X had always been by my side, silently assisting me with the heavy workload. Whether it was shareholder meetings or the various issues within and outside the family, every instruction had to be issued in Ronan's name as though he were still present. But the situation within the family and the company was gradually becoming more complicated. External forces had already started to sense Ronan's absence and were ramping up pressure on our company. The conflicts between shareholders were also escalating. Some shareholders began to stir, attempting to push their own interests, taking advantage of Ronan's unconsciousness. These power struggles and the games behind the scenes made every meeting a heavy burden for me. Every time I made a decision, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and with the slightest misstep, I could fall into an irreparable abyss. X, the core team members, and I had held countless meetings, discussing how to handle these sudden crises. But despite all this, the unease in my heart never subsided. The steps of our adversaries were becoming quicker, their conspiracies accelerating behind the scenes. Miss Alara, there's a problem we'll have to face at tomorrow's shareholders meeting. X's voice was low, tinged with an undeniable threat. Mr. Blackwood must be present, or it may directly affect whether the shareholders continue to support our leadership. His words gave me a headache. The shareholders' meeting was the most important decision-making moment for the family. It should have been chaired by Ronan, but now, due to his unconsciousness, we had already chaired it twice in his name. Though everything appeared to be running smoothly on the surface, the shareholders' patience was slowly running out. Especially the more restless ones who had already begun questioning whether Ronan could still control the company. X was keenly aware of the severity of this issue. He looked at me with a hint of concern in his eyes. At tomorrow's shareholders' meeting, all the shareholders will gather. External forces will increase their pressure. If Mr. Blackwood can't attend in person, they may directly challenge our leadership. A wave of heaviness sank in my chest. Ronan's unconsciousness had already created a significant crack, and now our enemies were attacking, trying to tear apart the family's power structure through this opening. Without Ronan's leadership, the family's foundation would be unstable, and the company's future would face a fatal threat. If Ronan can't attend, how can we stabilize the situation? I whispered, trying to keep calm. X furrowed his brow. If Mr. Blackwood can't personally appear, we must show that he is still in control of everything. We need to use the strongest measures to make all the shareholders believe that Mr. Blackwood is still in charge. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil within. I could feel X's intense gaze on me from beside me, and in his eyes, there was a light of trust. Miss Alara, no matter what happens, we will support you with all our strength. The next day, the shareholder meeting was held as scheduled. The atmosphere in the conference room was filled with tension as shareholders took their seats, their eyes full of doubt and expectation. Many were waiting for one answer. Is Ronan still in control after the assassination attempt? Although Ronan's will was being carried out in his name through me and X, this hollow power could not convince everyone. I stood at the long table, my heart racing. Today's shareholder meeting would decide the future of the company. Every shareholder's gaze intertwined, creating a suffocating sense of pressure and uncertainty. Miss Alara, Mr. Blackwood's current health status has raised increasing concerns, an elderly shareholder said coldly, his tone laced with obvious provocation. We cannot continue executing his will without seeing Mr. Blackwood in person. Can he still maintain control over the company and the family? The question of whether Mr. Blackwood is even alive has become a focus of attention. My heart tightened. Although I had anticipated such questions from the shareholders, facing them head-on still brought immense pressure. Ronan's coma had become an invisible blade hanging over our heads. Shareholders, Mr. Blackwood is currently ill, but he is still closely following everything. I tried to remain calm, my voice steady. Today, I continue to represent Mr. Blackwood in making important decisions regarding the company's future. My words were like a small spark, faintly flickering in the shareholders' ongoing discussions. But clearly they weren't enough to quell their doubts. We must see Mr. Blackwood in person. Surely, after being ill for such a long time, a brief appearance is possible. Another shareholder stood up, coldly staring at me. Miss Alara, perhaps we need to start considering selecting a new leader? I could feel the tension in the air growing stronger as the shareholders began whispering amongst themselves, their expressions complex. The pressure surged and X stood resolutely by my side, his gaze cold. But even he couldn't completely control the rising tide. The shareholders' doubts and dissatisfaction were like a flood sweeping toward us. I could sense their patience was running thin. Just as the meeting seemed on the verge of collapse, a sound came from the door. The door slowly creaked open and a figure appeared at the threshold. I held my breath. The familiar silhouette seemed to step out of the distant past, carrying an undeniable authority and strength. Ronan, still dressed in his custom-made suit, was seated in a wheelchair, gently pushed by two bodyguards. He slowly made his way into the shareholder meeting. The room fell into complete silence and all eyes immediately turned to him. Ronan's face appeared pale and weak, but his deep eyes still glowed with sharp intensity. Even in his weakened state, it seemed as though he could still suppress everything with his aura. X gave a slight nod, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief and respect as he watched Ronan enter the room. Ronan Blackwood. A shareholder exclaimed in surprise, his voice trembling with shock. Ronan slightly lifted his head and scanned the entire room. His voice was low and powerful. I've always been here. The future of the family and the company will not be decided by anyone except me. His words were like thunder, instantly shaking the entire room. Alara, continue presiding over the meeting. Ronan's gaze turned to me, filled with deep trust. I nodded, my heart filled with excitement. Ronan had finally awakened, and not just for his family and the company, but for the unfinished responsibility and commitment between us. Though a few faces in the room still wore complex expressions, Ronan's appearance undoubtedly provided us with the strongest support. Those who had once questioned and opposed us no longer had the courage to speak. Ronan's authority remained unshakable. In the days following the shareholder meeting, although Ronan's condition gradually improved, he remained weak. He still required strict rest and treatment, with doctors and nurses coming in regularly to check on him. However, Ronan persisted in handling family and company affairs. His eyes, though tired, still carried that unmistakable determination and strength, unwavering as ever. I gradually became involved in more and more decisions. While Ronan's recovery was progressing well, he seemed to intentionally or unintentionally draw me into discussions on various matters. Every decision we made was no longer simply a command from him but became a collaborative discussion between us. Previously, Ronan had always been the type to issue orders directly without seeking anyone else's opinion, especially not mine. He was always calm, rational, and authoritative, making all the decisions on his own. Now, however, it seemed that with every decision he was relying on me more and more, even asking for my input on the smallest of details, whether deliberately or not. Elara, what do you think about revising this contract clause? Ronan leaned back in his chair, his eyes showing a hint of fatigue but still deep and sharp. His voice was faint, yet it still carried that undeniable aura. I glanced at the document in my hand, frowning slightly. I think if we make a concession on this clause, it could cause dissatisfaction among the shareholders, especially. I looked up at him. How do you think we should balance this conflict of interests? Ronan gazed at me quietly for a moment before speaking. You used to handle these things so decisively. I remember you rarely concerned yourself with the details. He gave a small smile, a hint of tenderness flickering in his eyes. But now I find that your suggestions bring a fresh perspective. I was momentarily stunned. Ronan had never shared his thoughts with me like this before. He had always issued orders in a commanding tone, never allowing anyone else to take part in the decision-making process. Now he was asking for my opinions, even relying on me when dealing with business matters. This subtle shift left me feeling uncertain, unsure how to respond to this unexpected change. Ronan's recovery had entered a good phase. The daily treatments and recovery were gradually restoring the strength he once had. During this time, I stayed by Ronan's side, sharing every decision with him, standing with him to face the challenges at work. Our relationship had quietly changed. The coldness and distance that once existed between us had now turned into mutual reliance and care. One evening, in the office, I was organizing the documents for the next day, while Ronan sat on the sofa quietly watching me. Under the light, his outline was still strong, but his gaze carried a softness that I could feel, filled with unspoken emotions. Elara. His voice was low and gentle, breaking the silence. I looked up at him and gave a slight smile. What's up? He gently put down the documents in his hands, stood up and walked towards me. In that moment, I felt the firmness and strength in his steps, and his gentle gaze made my heart race. He stopped beside me, standing still, his eyes deep as he seemed to be contemplating something. You know, these past few days, I've been thinking about what I can do to make sure you stay by my side forever, Ronan said in a low voice, his tone serious with an undeniable determination. I froze for a moment, unsure why he was suddenly saying this. Ronan had never been so direct in expressing his feelings before, and I was caught off guard by his words. Ronan, what exactly are you saying? I tried to laugh lightly, but my heart felt uneasy. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he pulled out a small black box from his pocket. In that moment, my heart began to race uncontrollably. Ronan calmly opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond ring, sparkling with dazzling light. Elara, I want to make you a promise. He gently kneeled down, his eyes gleaming with immense tenderness. In this life, I want to walk with you no matter if it's through wind, rain, or sunshine. I hope you can accept me, become my wife, and walk hand in hand with me forever. At that moment, time seemed to stop. I looked into his deep eyes and suddenly understood everything. Ronan was no longer the cold, domineering CEO, nor the man who carried all the responsibility on his shoulders. All that remained in his eyes was deep affection and sincerity toward me. I froze, tears welling up in my eyes. His heartfelt sincerity touched me so deeply that I couldn't find the words to express how I felt. I gently reached out and stroked the back of his warm hand. Ronan, I'm willing. I finally said in a soft voice, my eyes filled with determination and tenderness. I'm willing to spend this life with you. Ronan's eyes brightened. Slowly, he placed the ring on my finger, his gaze full of deep love and contentment. In that moment, I felt that I was no longer alone, but tightly connected to him, walking side by side into the future. He stood up, gently pulling me into his arms, his voice low and tender. From now on, we will always be together. I held him tightly, closing my eyes and feeling the warmth of his presence. This was the happy moment I had always longed for. Ronan was no longer the distant, unattainable man, but had become an integral part of my life. Our future was no longer a blank slate. It was filled with our shared hopes and dreams.